You're not who you said you were, are you? Eleanor's voice trembled with a mixture of rage and heartbreak as she gripped the phone with white knuckles. The man on the other end of the line stammered, his smooth voice finally cracking under pressure. Eleanor, sweetheart, I don't know what you mean. Don't you dare call me sweetheart, she snapped, her gray eyes blazing with a fire that surprised even herself. I know exactly who you are, and more importantly, I know who you're not. Please let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. But let's go back to where this all began, 6 months earlier, when Eleanor Whitman thought she had nothing left to lose. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Eleanor's kitchen, casting gentle patterns across the worn wooden table where she sat with her cup of coffee, growing cold. At 69, Eleanor had perfected the art of quiet mornings, though she wouldn't have called it an art so much as a necessity. The house felt too big these days, too quiet, too full of memories that seemed to echo in every corner. 3 years had passed since Harold's funeral, 3 years since the flowers had wilted and the casserole dishes had been returned and life had settled into this strange new rhythm of solitude. Eleanor had grown accustomed to talking to herself, to eating dinner while watching the evening news, to going to bed each night in a space that felt impossibly vast without Harold's gentle snoring beside her. "Morning, Dad," she whispered to the framed photograph on the kitchen counter, Harold's kind eyes twinkling back at her from behind wire-rimmed glasses. It had become her daily ritual, this one-sided conversation with the man who had been her anchor for 43 years of marriage. The shrill ring of the telephone interrupted her quiet moment. Eleanor glanced at the caller ID and smiled despite herself. Sarah. Her daughter had developed an almost supernatural ability to call at precisely the moments when Eleanor felt most alone. "Good morning, sweetheart," Eleanor answered, settling back into her chair. "Morning, Mom. You sound tired. Did you sleep okay?" Sarah's voice carried that particular note of concern that had become more frequent over the past year. At 45, Sarah had inherited Harold's protective instincts and Eleanor's stubborn streak, a combination that made her both a devoted daughter and an occasionally overwhelming presence. "I slept fine, dear. Just enjoying my coffee in the morning quiet." Eleanor traced the rim of her cup with one finger, a habit she'd developed during their daily phone calls. "That's what I'm worried about," Sarah said gently. "Too much quiet, Mom. You know what Dr. Peterson said about staying social, staying engaged with people?" Eleanor sighed. Dr. Peterson, her well-meaning physician, had spent considerable time during her last checkup discussing the importance of maintaining social connections for her mental and physical health. He'd used words like isolation and depression risk factors that had made Eleanor feel like a medical condition rather than a person simply trying to navigate widowhood. "I'm social enough," Eleanor protested. "I talk to Mrs. Henderson next door, and I go to the grocery store, and I have you." "Mom." Sarah's voice took on that patient but firm tone that reminded Eleanor so much of herself when Sarah had been a stubborn teenager. "One neighbor, one grocery clerk, and your daughter do not constitute a social circle. When's the last time you did something just for fun? When's the last time you laughed with someone new?" Eleanor considered this question longer than she cared to admit. The truth was, most of her laughter these days came from late-night television comedies, and even then, it felt hollow without someone to share the joke with. "I've been thinking," Sarah continued when Eleanor didn't answer, "what if you tried meeting some new people? There are senior groups at the community center, book clubs even." She paused, and Eleanor could practically hear her daughter gathering courage for whatever came next. "Even dating sites for people your age." "Dating sites?" Eleanor nearly choked on her coffee. "Sarah Marie, what on earth would I do with a dating site?" "Meet people, Mom. Make friends. Maybe even find someone special. Dad wouldn't want you to be alone forever." The mention of Harold's wishes hit Eleanor like a gentle but persistent nudge. She could almost hear his voice, warm and encouraging. "Ellie, life's too short to spend it talking to photographs." Harold had always been practical about matters of the heart. He'd probably have signed her up for a dating site himself if he'd lived long enough to see her struggling with loneliness. "I wouldn't even know how to use such a thing," Eleanor said, though she could hear the curiosity creeping into her own voice. "That's what I'm here for. I could help you set up a profile, maybe this weekend when I come over to help with the gutters." Eleanor found herself considering the idea as she gazed out her kitchen window at the quiet street beyond. Mrs. Henderson was tending to her garden, moving with the careful precision of someone who understood that purpose could be found in the smallest tasks. But even Mrs. Henderson had her bridge club on Thursdays and her sister who visited from Phoenix twice a year. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt to look," Eleanor said finally. The enthusiasm in Sarah's voice was immediate and infectious. "Really? Oh, Mom, I think this could be wonderful for you. There are sites specifically designed for mature adults, very respectable ones. We'll create a profile that shows what an amazing woman you are." That Saturday afternoon, Sarah arrived at Eleanor's house with her laptop and an energy that reminded Eleanor of Christmas mornings when Sarah had been small. They settled at the kitchen table, the same spot where Eleanor had helped Sarah with homework decades earlier, and Sarah began navigating to something called Golden Connections. "See? Look how nice this is," Sarah said, angling the laptop screen toward her mother. "It's specifically for people over 55 who are looking for companionship, friendship, or romance. Very classy, very safe." Eleanor studied the homepage, which featured smiling couples of various ages walking on beaches, sharing coffee, laughing together in what appeared to be staged but heartwarming scenarios. The tagline read, "It's never too late for a second chance at happiness." "What would I even say about myself?" Eleanor asked, suddenly feeling overwhelmed by the prospect of summarizing nearly 7 decades of life into an online profile. "We'll start simple," Sarah said, opening a new account setup page. "Name, age, location, then a little bit about your interests, what you're looking for. Just be yourself, Mom. You're interesting, you're kind, you have great stories. Any man would be lucky to get to know you." Over the next hour, they crafted Eleanor's profile together. Sarah handled the technical aspects while Eleanor provided the content, slowly warming to the idea as they described her love of gardening, her volunteer work at the library, her passion for old movies and crossword puzzles. For her profile photo, they chose a recent picture from Sarah's birthday dinner, where Eleanor's smile looked natural and her silver hair caught the light in a way that made her look both dignified and approachable. "There," Sarah said, hitting the submit button with a flourish. "Eleanor Whitman is officially ready to meet the world." The first few days after creating her profile, Eleanor found herself checking the site with a mixture of excitement and nervousness that she hadn't felt since high school. Several men had viewed her profile and sent brief messages: a retired accountant who loved fishing, a widower who collected stamps, a former teacher who quoted poetry in his introduction. But it was Robert Mitchell who caught her attention. His message arrived on a Tuesday morning, longer and more thoughtful than the others. "Dear Eleanor," it began, "I hope you don't mind me reaching out, but your profile spoke to me in a way that I wasn't expecting. Like you, I lost my spouse several years ago, and like you, I've discovered that loneliness is perhaps life's most unexpected challenge. Your mention of volunteering at the library particularly resonated with me. I spent 30 years as a literature professor, and I've always believed that books are portals to understanding both ourselves and others. I'd love to hear about your favorite authors, if you're inclined to share. With warm regards, Robert." Eleanor read the message 3 times before responding, each reading revealing new layers of thoughtfulness. Robert's profile described him as a 71-year-old retired professor from the University of Michigan, a widower of 4 years, who enjoyed classical music, hiking, and cooking elaborate meals for friends. His profile photo showed a distinguished man with gray hair and kind eyes, wearing a cable-knit sweater and standing in front of what appeared to be a well-stocked bookshelf. Their correspondence began with tentative exchanges about literature and gradually expanded to encompass their shared experiences of loss, their hopes for the future, and the small daily observations that had once been shared with spouses. Robert wrote beautifully, with a professor's precision but a poet's heart. He remembered details from Eleanor's previous messages and asked follow-up questions that showed he was truly listening to her words. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding Harold's garden," he wrote in one message. "How you've maintained it not because you particularly enjoy gardening, but because it feels like tending to his memory. I do something similar with Margaret's piano. I can't play a note, but I dust it every week and keep it tuned, as if she might walk through the door at any moment and fill the house with Chopin again." These messages began arriving daily, sometimes twice daily, and Eleanor found herself structuring her routine around checking her email. Robert's virtual presence became a bright spot in her days, a reason to hurry through morning coffee so she could see if he'd written overnight. After 2 weeks of correspondence, Robert suggested they move to phone calls. "I hope this isn't too forward," he wrote, "but I find myself wanting to hear your voice. Would you be comfortable talking on the phone? I'd love to have a real conversation with you." Eleanor's hands shook slightly as she typed her response, providing her phone number along with the suggestion that he call that evening around 7 o'clock and 10. When the phone rang at exactly 7, Eleanor's heart fluttered in a way that made her feel simultaneously foolish and wonderfully alive. "Eleanor?" The voice was warm and cultured, with just a hint of a Midwestern accent. "This is Robert. I hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all," Eleanor said, settling into her favorite armchair with a cup of tea she'd prepared specifically for the occasion. "I've been looking forward to this." Their first conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. Robert was everything his letters had suggested: thoughtful, well-read, genuinely interested in Eleanor's opinions and experiences. He asked about her late husband with sensitivity, shared stories about his own marriage with Margaret, and somehow managed to make Eleanor laugh more in one evening than she had in months. "I have to admit something," Robert said as their conversation wound down. "I was nervous about calling you. It's been a long time since I've talked to someone new, someone I wanted to impress." "You wanted to impress me?" Eleanor asked, surprised by her own boldness in the question. "Very much," Robert replied, and Eleanor could hear the smile in his voice. "I hope I succeeded at least a little." "More than a little," Eleanor admitted, and they both laughed at her confession. These phone calls became a nightly ritual. Robert would call at 7, and they would talk until Eleanor's tea grew cold, and the evening news began playing in the background. He told her about his work at the university, his research into American literature, his travels to conferences around the country. Eleanor shared stories about her volunteer work, her memories of raising Sarah, her struggles with adjusting to life alone. "You know what I love about talking to you?" Robert said during one of their conversations. "You make me remember who I was before grief became my primary identity. With you, I'm not just the widower Robert or the professor who lost his wife. I'm just Robert, talking to Eleanor, and that feels like coming back to life." Eleanor understood exactly what he meant. For the first time since Harold's death, she felt like herself again. Not Harold's widow, not Sarah's mother who needed constant checking on, but Eleanor, a woman worthy of attention and affection in her own right. As weeks passed, their conversations grew more intimate. Robert shared his fears about aging alone, his regrets about not traveling more with Margaret before her illness, his dreams of finding companionship in his remaining years. Eleanor found herself opening up about feelings she'd barely admitted to herself, the terror of becoming a burden to Sarah, the loneliness that sometimes felt so overwhelming she could barely breathe, the guilt she felt about wanting to be happy again. "There's no timeline for healing," Robert told her one evening when she'd confessed to feeling guilty about enjoying their conversations. "Margaret used to say that love doesn't diminish when it's shared, it multiplies. I think she'd be happy that I've found someone who makes me smile again. And I'm certain Harold would want the same for you." It was during their 3rd week of nightly phone calls that Robert first mentioned his difficulties. "I hope you'll forgive me for bringing this up," he said, his voice carrying a note of embarrassment, "but I'm in a bit of a bind, and I'm not sure who else I can talk to about it." Eleanor immediately felt a surge of concern. "What's wrong, Robert? Is everything okay?" "It's my grandson, Michael," Robert explained. "He's 22, just graduated from college, and he's been staying with me while he looks for work. The problem is, he got into some trouble. Nothing serious, just a misunderstanding with campus security, but it's going to cost about $500 to resolve. I hate to admit this, but retirement doesn't leave much room for unexpected expenses, and my pension won't cover it." Eleanor's heart went out to him. She could hear the pain in his voice, the shame of a proud man admitting financial struggle. "That sounds terrible, Robert. Is there anything I can do to help?" "Oh, no," Robert said quickly. "I wouldn't dream of asking you for money, Eleanor. I just needed to talk to someone about it. Sometimes sharing a burden makes it feel lighter, you know." But Eleanor found herself thinking about Robert's situation long after their conversation ended. $500 wasn't an insignificant amount, but it wasn't devastating either, and she had some savings that Harold had been careful to build up over the years. The idea of Robert struggling with financial stress when she could easily help felt wrong to her. The next morning, she called Sarah to discuss the situation. "Mom, slow down," Sarah said after Eleanor had rushed through an explanation of Robert's dilemma. "You want to send money to someone you've never met?" "It's not just someone, Sarah. It's Robert. We've been talking every night for 3 weeks. I feel like I know him better than I know some people I've met in person." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Mom, I understand that you care about him, but sending money to someone from an online dating site, that raises some red flags for me." "Red flags?" Eleanor felt a flash of irritation. "Sarah, Robert isn't some scammer. He's a retired professor who's helped his grandson and is facing an unexpected expense." "He didn't even ask me for money," I offered. "Did you offer, or did he set it up so you would offer?" Eleanor paused, replaying the conversation in her mind. Robert had seemed genuinely reluctant to discuss his financial troubles, and he'd specifically said he wouldn't ask her for money. He was very clear that he wasn't asking for help. "Mom, I'm sure he seems like a wonderful man, and maybe he is, but please just be careful. Promise me you won't send money without talking to me first?" Eleanor agreed, though she felt frustrated by what seemed like Sarah's excessive caution. That evening, when Robert called, she broached the subject carefully. "I've been thinking about what you told me last night," she said, "about Michael's situation." "Please don't worry about that," Robert said immediately. "I shouldn't have burdened you with my problems." "It's not a burden, Robert. That's what friends do. They help each other. I'd like to help you with the $500. "Eleanor, I can't possibly accept that." "Yes, you can," Eleanor said firmly. "I have some savings, and Harold always believed in helping people when you're able to. It would make me happy to know I could help you and Michael." After much back and forth, Robert reluctantly agreed to accept her help. "I'll pay you back as soon as my next pension check arrives," he promised. "You're an angel, Eleanor. I don't know what I did to deserve someone like you in my life." Eleanor felt a warm glow of satisfaction as she arranged to send the money via wire transfer the next morning. The process was more complicated than she'd expected, requiring multiple forms and verification steps, but the bank employee was helpful and patient. "Is this going to someone you know well?" the teller asked as Eleanor filled out the paperwork. "Yes," Eleanor said without hesitation. "A very close friend." Robert was effusive in his gratitude when the money arrived. "You've saved my grandson from a terrible situation," he told her that evening. "I can't begin to express how much this means to me." Their relationship seemed to deepen after Eleanor's act of generosity. Robert's messages became more romantic, filled with expressions of growing affection and hints about their future together. "I find myself thinking about you constantly," he wrote. "About what it would be like to hold your hand, to see your beautiful smile in person, to share quiet mornings and peaceful evenings with you." Eleanor treasured these messages, printing them out and keeping them in a small box on her nightstand. She began to imagine a future beyond loneliness, beyond the empty house and one-sided conversations with Harold's photograph. But as their relationship progressed, Robert's problems seemed to multiply. 2 weeks after the grandson incident, he called with another crisis. "I'm so embarrassed to tell you this," he said, his voice strained with emotion. "But my car broke down today. The transmission needs to be replaced, and the repair shop wants $3,000. Without a car, I can't get to my doctor's appointments, can't get groceries. I feel so helpless, Eleanor." Eleanor's heart ached for him. "That's terrible, Robert. What will you do?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I've called my bank about a loan, but my credit isn't what it used to be. I suppose I'll have to take the bus everywhere, though at my age that's not exactly safe or practical." Once again, Eleanor found herself offering to help, and once again, Robert initially refused before reluctantly accepting her assistance. The $3,000 represented a more significant chunk of her savings, but Eleanor reasoned that Robert would pay her back, and more importantly, that this was what loving partnerships were about, supporting each other through difficulties. Sarah's reaction to news of the second wire transfer was less understanding. $3,000, Mom? To someone you still haven't met in person? Eleanor was sitting in her kitchen, the phone pressed to her ear while she absently traced patterns on the table with her finger. His car broke down, Sarah. He needs transportation. Has he offered to pay back the first $500 yet? Eleanor paused. His pension check was smaller than expected. He's going to pay me back both amounts when his investment dividends come in next month. Investment dividends? Sarah's voice rose in pitch. Mom, this is starting to sound like a scam. A scam? Eleanor felt a flash of anger. Sarah, Robert is not a scammer. He's a professor, a widower, someone who's been nothing but kind and honest with me. How do you know he's a professor? How do you know anything about him is true? Because I talk to him every night. Because I know him. You know what he's told you about himself, Sarah corrected. That's not the same thing. Their conversation deteriorated into an argument, with Sarah expressing growing concern about Eleanor's judgment and Eleanor defending Robert with increasing intensity. They hung up with tension between them that felt foreign and uncomfortable. That evening, Robert called as usual, and Eleanor found herself telling him about her argument with Sarah. I'm so sorry, Robert said, his voice heavy with guilt. This is all my fault. I've put you in an impossible position with your daughter. It's not your fault, Eleanor assured him. Sarah's just being overprotective. She doesn't understand our relationship. Maybe I should talk to her, Robert suggested. Explain the situation. Assure her that my intentions with you are completely honorable. Eleanor considered this idea. She'd probably like that, actually. She's always been suspicious of things she doesn't understand. But when Eleanor suggested a three-way phone call, Robert always had reasons why it wouldn't work. His phone plan didn't support conference calls. He was dealing with too much stress to handle a potentially confrontational conversation. He thought it might be better if Eleanor and Sarah worked things out between themselves first. As autumn progressed into winter, Robert's financial crises seemed to escalate. His health insurance had denied coverage for a necessary medical procedure, leaving him with a $4,000 bill. His apartment building was being converted to condominiums, and he needed money for a deposit on a new place. His sister in California had suffered a stroke, and he needed funds to travel to see her. Each crisis was presented with apparent reluctance, accompanied by protests that he hated to burden Eleanor with his problems. But somehow, Eleanor always found herself offering to help, and Robert always eventually, reluctantly, accepted her assistance. By December, Eleanor had sent Robert nearly $15,000. Sarah's visits became tense affairs. She would arrive at Eleanor's house with a forced smile and carefully neutral questions about Robert. How are things going with your friend? She would ask, and Eleanor could hear the skepticism underlying the polite inquiry. He's wonderful, Eleanor would respond, though she found herself mentioning fewer details about their conversations and avoiding any discussion of the financial help she'd provided. The truth was, Eleanor had begun to feel a nagging sense of unease about certain aspects of her relationship with Robert. He still hadn't been able to arrange a video call, always citing technical difficulties or a broken camera that he couldn't afford to replace. He'd canceled 3 separate plans to meet in person, once due to a sudden illness, once because of a family emergency, and once because his car, which she'd helped repair, had broken down again. But his nightly phone calls continued to be the highlight of Eleanor's days. Robert was attentive, affectionate, and seemed to genuinely care about her thoughts and feelings. When she mentioned feeling lonely during a particularly gray December day, he'd called her an hour later just to check on her. When she'd told him about Harold's birthday, he'd sent flowers with a note that read, "For remembering love, and for having the courage to love again." "I wish I could be there with you," he said frequently. "I think about what it would be like to hold you, to comfort you in person. You deserve so much more than these phone calls, Eleanor." These expressions of longing kept Eleanor's hopes alive, even as the rational part of her mind began to catalog inconsistencies in Robert's stories. Why couldn't a retired professor afford to fix his camera? Why didn't he have any family or friends who could help with his various financial emergencies? Why did every plan to meet in person fall through at the last minute? The turning point came in early January, when Robert called with what he described as his most serious crisis yet. "Eleanor, I don't know how to tell you this," he said, his voice shaking with what sounded like genuine fear. "I've been diagnosed with a serious heart condition." I need surgery, but my insurance won't cover the full cost. I'm looking at a $20,000 bill and without the surgery." He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. Eleanor felt the room spin around her. "Robert, that's terrible. How serious is it?" "Very serious," he said quietly. "The doctors say I can't wait more than a few weeks." "Eleanor, I hate to even think about this, but if something happens to me, I want you to know how much you've meant to me. You've brought joy back into my life when I thought I'd never feel joy again." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Robert describing his medical situation in detail and Eleanor offering comfort and support. By the time they hung up, Eleanor had promised to help with the surgery costs, even though it would require her to dip into the emergency fund that Harold had insisted they maintain. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around her, Eleanor found herself thinking about Sarah's warnings with new clarity. $20,000 was not a small amount. It was money that Harold had worked years to save, money that was supposed to ensure Eleanor's security in her later years. More troubling than the amount was the pattern that had emerged over the past several months. Robert's crises were always urgent, always required immediate financial assistance, and always seemed to get worse despite Eleanor's help. For someone who claimed to have a pension and investment income, he certainly seemed to face an unusual number of financial emergencies. The next morning, Eleanor called Sarah. "I need to talk to you about Robert," she said without preamble when her daughter answered. Sarah's voice immediately became alert. "What's happened?" Eleanor explained about the heart surgery, about Robert's request for $20,000, about her growing concerns regarding the pattern of his financial needs. "Mom," Sarah said gently, "I'm going to come over today, and I'm going to bring my laptop. Will you let me do some research into Robert's background, just to put your mind at ease?" Eleanor agreed, though part of her dreaded what Sarah might find. Sarah arrived that afternoon with her laptop and a determination that reminded Eleanor of Sarah as a child working on a school project. They settled at the kitchen table and Sarah opened her computer. "What's Robert's full name again?" Sarah asked. "Robert Mitchell. He taught at the University of Michigan." Sarah began typing, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. "Let me start with a reverse image search on his profile photo." Eleanor watched as Sarah uploaded Robert's profile picture to what appeared to be a search engine designed specifically for images. Within seconds, results began appearing on the screen. "Oh, Mom," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with sympathy. "What is it?" Sarah turned the laptop screen toward Eleanor. The same photograph that Robert had used in his dating profile appeared multiple times across the screen, but it wasn't associated with anyone named Robert Mitchell. According to the search results, the photo was a stock image used by various websites and marketing materials. The model's name was listed as David Chen, and the photo was available for purchase from several stock photography sites. Eleanor stared at the screen, feeling as though the floor had dropped out from under her. That can't be right. "I'm so sorry, Mom," Sarah said, reaching across the table to take Eleanor's hand. "Let me check something else." Sarah navigated to the University of Michigan's website and searched for faculty directories, both current and retired. They searched variations of Robert Mitchell's name, looked through literature department listings, and even searched archived faculty pages. No one matching Robert's description appeared anywhere in the university's records. "Maybe he taught at a different university," Eleanor said weakly, though she could feel her last hopes crumbling. Sarah continued searching, checking multiple university websites, professional academic directories, and public records databases. No Robert Mitchell matching the age and background of Eleanor's correspondent existed anywhere they looked. "Mom," Sarah said gently, "I think we need to consider the possibility that Robert isn't who he claims to be." Eleanor felt tears beginning to burn behind her eyes. "But we talk every night. He knows so much about literature, about teaching, he couldn't fake that." "He could if he's done this before," Sarah said sadly. "If he's been running this kind of scam for a while, he'd have learned enough to sound convincing." The word scam hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She thought about all the money she'd sent, all the intimate conversations they'd shared, all the hope she'd invested in their relationship. The man she'd been falling in love with didn't exist. "How much money have you sent him, Mom?" Sarah asked quietly. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "Almost $15,000. And he's asked for 20,000 more. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, and Eleanor could see her daughter calculating the financial damage. Okay, we're gonna figure this out. First, let's see if we can find out who Robert really is. Over the next several hours, Sarah conducted an exhaustive investigation. She traced the phone number Robert had been using to a prepaid cell phone service. She found identical dating profiles on multiple sites, all using different names but similar stories and the same stolen photographs. She discovered forum discussions where other victims described being scammed by someone matching Robert's profile and approach. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a post on a scam awareness website. This woman in Florida describes the exact same story. The grandson in trouble, the car repairs, the heart surgery, even some of the same phrases that Robert used with you. Eleanor read the post with growing horror. The woman described months of phone calls with a charming, educated man who had systematically drained her retirement savings with a series of increasingly urgent financial emergencies. The parallels to Eleanor's experience were unmistakable. "There are dozens of these stories," Sarah continued, scrolling through more posts. "This is an organized operation, Mom. You're not the only victim." Eleanor felt a mixture of relief and shame. Relief that she wasn't alone in being deceived, shame that she'd been so easily manipulated. What do I do now? First, we call the police and report this. Then we call your bank and see if there's any way to recover the money you've already sent. And then, Sarah hesitated. What? Then you call Robert and confront him. Eleanor's stomach clenched at the thought. I don't know if I can do that. You can, Mom. You're stronger than you know, and maybe, just maybe, if we handle this right, we can prevent him from doing this to someone else. That evening, Eleanor sat by her phone as 7 o'clock approached, feeling sick with anxiety. Sarah had positioned herself at the kitchen table with her laptop open, ready to record the conversation and trace the call if possible. The phone rang at exactly 7, as it had every night for months. "Eleanor, sweetheart," Robert's familiar voice said when she answered. "How are you feeling today? You sounded worried last night." For a moment, Eleanor almost lost her nerve. The voice was so warm, so familiar, so caring. But then she looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly, and she found her strength. "I'm not good, Robert," Eleanor said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I've been doing some research today." "Research?" Robert's tone became cautious. "About what?" "About you." There was a long pause on the line. When Robert spoke again, his voice had lost some of its warmth. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean the fact that Robert Mitchell never taught at the University of Michigan. I mean the fact that your profile photo is a stock image. I mean the fact that you're not who you say you are." Another pause, longer this time. Eleanor could hear her heart beating in the silence. "Eleanor, I think there's been some misunderstanding." "No," Eleanor interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "There's been no misunderstanding. You're a liar and a thief, and I know exactly what you've been doing to me." The silence stretched between them, heavy with tension. Eleanor could hear her own breathing, could see Sarah watching her with a mixture of pride and concern. "Eleanor," Robert said finally, and his voice was different now, harder, less refined. The cultured professor's accent had disappeared, replaced by something rougher, more calculating. "You don't understand the situation." "I understand perfectly," Eleanor said, feeling a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. "You've been pretending to care about me while stealing my money. You've made me believe that someone could love me again, and it was all a lie." "Look, lady," the man said, dropping all pretense now. "You gave me that money willingly. I never forced you to do anything." "You manipulated me," Eleanor shot back. "You preyed on my loneliness, my grief. You made me think you were someone you're not." "I gave you what you wanted," he said coldly. "You wanted someone to talk to, someone to make you feel special. I provided that service. The money was just payment for my time." Eleanor felt as though she'd been slapped. The cruelty in his voice, the casual dismissal of her feelings, made her realize just how thoroughly she'd been deceived. This person bore no resemblance to the caring, thoughtful man she'd believed herself to be falling in love with. "You're not Robert Mitchell," she said. "No, I'm not. And you're not getting your money back, so don't even think about trying." "We'll see about that," Eleanor said, and she hung up the phone with a firmness that felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Sarah immediately came to her side. "Mom, you were incredible. Did you hear how his voice changed when you confronted him?" Eleanor was shaking, adrenaline coursing through her system. "I can't believe I fell for it. I can't believe I was so stupid." "You weren't stupid," Sarah said firmly. "You were lonely, and you were trusting, and those are not character flaws. This person is a professional criminal who knows exactly how to manipulate people's emotions." Over the next few days, Eleanor and Sarah worked together to report the crime to multiple authorities. They contacted the local police, the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, and the Federal Trade Commission. They provided all the documentation Eleanor had saved, the wire transfer receipts, printed emails, phone records showing the calls from Robert's number. Detective Maria Santos from the local police department was assigned to Eleanor's case. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that Eleanor found comforting. "Mrs. Whitman," Detective Santos said during their meeting at the police station, "I want you to know that this type of crime is much more common than people realize. Romance scams targeting older adults have become a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise." "Will I get my money back?" Eleanor asked, though she already suspected the answer. Detective Santos looked sympathetic, but realistic. "I'll be honest with you, recovery of funds in these cases is rare. These criminals often operate from other countries, and they move money quickly through multiple accounts to make it difficult to trace. However, by reporting this, you're helping us build a case that might prevent others from being victimized. What happens now?" "We'll work with federal authorities to try to track down the person or group behind this scam. Your phone records and the information your daughter gathered will be valuable evidence. We'll also put out alerts to other law enforcement agencies about this particular operation." Eleanor left the police station feeling a mixture of hope and resignation. The money was probably gone forever, but at least she'd done something to fight back. The hardest part of the aftermath wasn't the financial loss, devastating though it was. The hardest part was dealing with the emotional devastation of realizing that the relationship she'd treasured had never existed. Eleanor found herself grieving not just for the money, but for Robert, or rather, for the man she'd thought Robert was. "I know it sounds crazy," she told Sarah one afternoon as they sat in Eleanor's living room, "but I miss him. I miss our conversations, our connection. Even though I know it was all fake, it felt real to me." Sarah reached over and took her mother's hand. "It's not crazy at all, Mom. Your feelings were real, even if he wasn't. You opened your heart to what you thought was love, and that took courage. I feel like such a fool." "You're not a fool. You're a woman who was brave enough to try to find happiness again. The fact that you encountered a criminal doesn't diminish that courage." Eleanor appreciated Sarah's support, but she still struggled with feelings of shame and self-doubt. How had she been so blind to the warning signs? How had she let herself believe that a stranger could care about her so deeply? Dr. Peterson, her physician, referred her to a counselor who specialized in helping victims of financial scams. Dr. Rebecca Chen was a soft-spoken woman who helped Eleanor understand that romance scammers were skilled professionals who employed sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques. "These criminals study human psychology," Dr. Chen explained during one of their sessions. "They know exactly how to identify vulnerable targets and how to create artificial intimacy. What happened to you wasn't a failure of judgment. It was a criminal exploitation of your natural human need for connection." "But I should have been more suspicious," Eleanor insisted. "Sarah tried to warn me." "The reason these scams work is that they're designed to override our natural suspicions," Dr. Chen said. "The criminals create a sense of urgency and emotional dependency that makes it difficult to think clearly. They also isolate victims from family and friends who might ask uncomfortable questions." Eleanor realized this was exactly what had happened. She'd become so invested in her relationship with Robert that she'd dismissed Sarah's concerns and avoided discussing details that might have revealed inconsistencies in his stories. The counseling sessions helped, but Eleanor still felt a profound sense of loss and betrayal. The scammer hadn't just stolen her money, he'd stolen her confidence in her own judgment and her faith in the possibility of finding love again. 3 weeks after the confrontation phone call, Detective Santos called with an update. "Mrs. Whitman, I have some news," she said. "We've been working with federal authorities and we believe we've identified the person behind your scam." Eleanor felt her heart race. "You found him?" "We found him. His real name is Marcus Webb, and he's been running romance scams for at least 5 years. He's based in Detroit, and he had multiple fake profiles on various dating sites. Your case helped us connect him to at least a dozen other victims." "Have you arrested him?" "We have. He was arrested yesterday morning and charged with wire fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. The federal charges alone could result in decades in prison." Eleanor felt a surge of satisfaction that surprised her with its intensity. "Good." "There's more," Detective Santos continued. "When they searched his apartment, they found detailed records of all his victims, including you. He kept files with personal information, conversation logs, and financial records. It's clear this was a sophisticated, organized operation." "Will any of the victims get their money back?" "We're still investigating his finances, but he appears to have spent most of the money he stole. However, the prosecutor's office is exploring the possibility of restitution as part of any plea agreement." Eleanor hung up the phone feeling a sense of closure she hadn't expected. The man who had deceived her was facing justice, and her willingness to come forward had helped protect other potential victims. That evening, Sarah came over for dinner, as had become their new routine since the scam was discovered. Their relationship had grown stronger through the crisis, with Eleanor appreciating Sarah's support and Sarah gaining new respect for her mother's resilience. "I have something to tell you," Eleanor said as they cleared the dinner dishes. "I've been thinking about what I want to do next." "Oh?" Sarah looked curious. "I want to volunteer with an organization that helps scam victims. Detective Santos told me about a group that provides support and education to people who've been targeted by these criminals." Sarah smiled. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Mom. I also want to share my story more widely. I've been thinking about speaking at senior centers, community groups, anywhere that people might benefit from hearing about what happened to me. That takes a lot of courage." Eleanor considered this. "Maybe. But I think it takes more courage to stay silent and let other people fall into the same trap I did." Over the following months, Eleanor threw herself into her new volunteer work with an energy and purpose she hadn't felt in years. She joined the Senior Fraud Prevention Coalition, where she helped train other volunteers and spoke to groups about recognizing and avoiding romance scams. Her first speaking engagement was at the community center where Sarah had originally suggested she might find social activities. Eleanor stood before a group of about 30 older adults and told her story with a clarity and strength that surprised even herself. "I want you to understand," she said to the attentive audience, "that what happened to me wasn't about being stupid or gullible. These criminals are professionals who know exactly how to exploit our basic human need for connection and companionship." After her presentation, several people approached her with their own stories, some who had been victimized by scams, others who had narrowly avoided falling into similar traps. Eleanor realized that her experience, painful as it had been, could serve a greater purpose in protecting others. "You saved me from making a terrible mistake," one woman told her after a presentation at a local library. "I was about to send money to someone I met online, but your story made me realize how similar the situation was to what you described." These encounters reinforced Eleanor's belief that speaking out about her experience was the right choice. Each person she potentially helped made the financial and emotional cost of her own victimization feel more bearable. 6 months after Marcus Webb's arrest, Eleanor received a call from the prosecutor's office. Webb had agreed to a plea bargain that included attempting to pay restitution to his victims. "It's not going to be the full amount," the prosecutor explained. "He doesn't have the resources to repay everyone completely, but you should receive approximately $4,000, which represents about a quarter of what you lost." Eleanor was grateful for any recovery, but more importantly, she was satisfied knowing that Webb would spend the next 8 years in federal prison. The judge had specifically mentioned the impact on elderly victims during sentencing, noting that romance scams represented a particularly cruel form of exploitation. As summer arrived, Eleanor reflected on the changes in her life over the past year. The naive woman who had so eagerly embraced online dating seemed like a different person now. She was warier, more cautious, but also stronger and more purposeful than she had been since Harold's death. She had found a community among her fellow volunteers and the groups she spoke to. Her calendar was full of activities and commitments that gave her days structure and meaning. Most importantly, she had discovered that she could transform her worst experience into something that helped others. "I've been thinking," Sarah said during one of their regular dinners together. "You seem happier now than you have since Dad died." Eleanor considered this observation. "I am happier, in a way. Not because of what happened to me, but because of what I've done with what happened to me." "Do you think you'll ever try dating again?" Eleanor smiled. "Maybe someday. But if I do, it will be very different. I'll meet people in person, through activities I enjoy, with the support of friends and family. I won't be looking for someone to fill the empty spaces in my life. I've learned to fill those spaces myself." That evening, after Sarah had gone home, Eleanor sat in her favorite chair with a cup of tea and looked around her living room. Harold's photograph still sat on the side table, but it no longer felt like the center of her daily existence. She had created a life that honored his memory while belonging entirely to her present self. "I think you'd be proud of me, Harold," she said to the photograph. "I made some mistakes, but I figured out how to turn them into something good." Outside her window, Mrs. Henderson was working in her garden in the early evening light. Eleanor made a mental note to invite her over for coffee soon. She had learned that loneliness was not something to be cured by a single relationship, but rather something to be managed through multiple connections, purposeful activities, and most importantly, a sense of self-worth that came from within. The phone rang, and Eleanor answered it with the confidence of someone who had learned to trust her own judgment again. "Eleanor, it's Margaret from the Senior Center," the voice said. "I have a request for you. There's a woman in Oakville who heard about your presentation and wants to know if you'd be willing to speak to her daughter about a situation she's concerned about." "Of course," Eleanor said without hesitation. "What's the situation?" "The daughter has been sending money to someone she met online. The mother is worried, but the daughter won't listen to her." Eleanor felt the familiar surge of purpose that had become her new normal. "I'll drive out there this weekend. Send me the details." As she hung up the phone, Eleanor realized that the woman she had become was someone she actually liked and respected. She had learned that strength could emerge from vulnerability, that wisdom could grow from mistakes, and that helping others could transform personal pain into communal healing. The scammer who had called himself Robert Mitchell had taken her money and betrayed her trust, but he had inadvertently given her something valuable in return: a sense of purpose, a community of people she could help, and the knowledge that she was far stronger than she had ever imagined. 3 years after Harold's death, Eleanor Whitman had finally found her way back to a life worth living. It wasn't the life she had expected or planned for, but it was undeniably, authentically hers. The next morning, Eleanor woke up with sunlight streaming through her bedroom windows and the sound of birds singing in Harold's garden. She had work to do, people to help, and a full life to live. She got dressed with the energy of someone who had places to go and people who needed her. Before leaving for her first appointment of the day, she stopped by Harold's photograph in the kitchen. "Thank you for teaching me what real love looks like," she said quietly. "It helped me recognize the fake kind when I needed to." Then Eleanor Whitman, survivor, advocate, and fighter, headed out into the world to make sure that what had happened to her would never happen to anyone else if she could help it. And she could help it. She was absolutely certain of that. Thank you for listening until the end. If you enjoyed the story, please consider leaving us a like. This helps us reach more people.